Hey guys, this is Mr. Bearline back with your next video lesson. I'm in here on a snow day actually making these videos. So we're going to talk about today, we're going to continue our discussion of post-war America. Specifically, we're going to talk about the Eisenhower administration. Talk about how he was voted in, how the Cold War affects his administration, and the Cold War hotspots of the 1950s. We don't talk about the Cold War in the 50s abroad very often, but of course, there was plenty going on during this time. All right, so election of 1952. Truman basically was the president, or he was the president, and he had, while he was in office, there was an amendment passed that the president could certainly serve a max of 10 years. So like if a vice president took over more than 2 years, with more than 2 years left on a president's term, he could only win re-election twice. So, therefore, it limited what vice presidents could do. So, he would have served longer than 10 years had he run for re-election and won. But he was excluded from the limit, which really didn't matter because he probably would have been defeated anyway. So, he didn't seek re-election in 1952. Instead, the Democrats nominate Adlai Stevenson. Adlai Stevenson was a popular senator, but the Republicans chose Dwight D. Eisenhower, the hero of World War II. And Eisenhower was extremely popular, and he had the catchy nickname called Ike. He nominated Richard Nixon, a popular, famous politician of the time, to be his vice presidential candidate. Now, he campaigns on winning the war or ending the war in Korea. That was his campaign promise. And the war had become especially unpopular and probably would have sunk Truman's chances of winning re-election anyway. So he appoints Nixon, but Nixon's accused of dishonesty. So Nixon has to go on TV and he makes this famous speech called the Checkers speech. Nixon was accused of making an $18,000 slush fund for personal use made up of gifts from political supporters. It was illegal, but Nixon's accuser said, it's not illegal, but he's being dishonest. He's not using these funds the way he should be. So he goes on television to defend his actions and claims that he didn't use the fund improperly and only accepted one special gift in 1952, a Cocker Spaniel named Checkers. And he actually says, we're not giving the dog back, basically. So his performance, this speech, really kind of saves his position as a vice presidential candidate. At any rate, Eisenhower kept his campaign promise after winning, travels to Korea, and tried to get the peace talks moving. Finally, they do sign an armistice in 1953. However, the Cold War itself is not stopped. I mean, the Korean War was ended, but the Cold War itself did not. And Eisenhower selects John Foster Dulles to be his Secretary of State. Dulles goes on to be one of the most influential and important Secretaries of State in American history. You had a lot of things going on here. You had a change of leadership in the Soviet Union. Stalin had died. Khrushchev was now in charge in the Soviet Union. So, there's a brief opportunity for improved relations, but that passes and it doesn't happen. Khrushchev has to kind of balance his anti-Stalinist rhetoric with, being extra tough on America. This keeps tensions high between the United States and the Soviet Union. This is going to continue throughout the next couple of decades. All right, so Dulles was critical of the Democrats' philosophy, his foreign policy. He said containment of communism was not enough. Just keeping it from spreading was not enough. He wanted to push back against it, to expand democracy. So he develops a foreign policy that Eisenhower follows called brinkmanship. And this is the idea of convincing the other side that you're willing to go to war. Basically, brinkmanship is the diplomacy of going right to the brink of war without actually starting war. And so as a result of that, if the United States is going to say, we're going to go to war against you, they've got to have the military weapons to back it up. So, part of this is the United States drastically increases spending on the nuclear arsenal. Dulles also believed in the concept of massive retaliation. And that's the promise that the U.S. will use overwhelming force against any Soviet aggression. And basically what this means is we have this massive nuclear arsenal and we'll use it. So basically this begins the idea of the United States and the Soviet Union having a foreign policy based on what's called mutually assured destruction. You launch against us, we're going to launch everything against you, and everybody's going to die, basically. That was kind of the idea of this foreign policy. All right, so there's a secret side of this foreign policy, and it's the development of the Central Intelligence Agency and a large network of spies that will try to infiltrate communist nations, specifically the Soviet Union. Of course, the Soviet Union has the KGB that does the same thing in the United States. All right, so like I mentioned earlier, the Soviet Union has seen some changes. Stalin dies in '53, and Khrushchev emerges as a leader. And Khrushchev takes this very anti-Stalinist approach. He makes a secret speech in front of the Communist Party, and he basically says that Stalin was bad, that he built this cult of personality around himself, and that that wasn't what the Soviet Union should be about. So even though it remains a dictatorship under the tight control of Khrushchev, they do make some reforms to roll back some of Stalin's changes. And also Khrushchev leads in the creation of what becomes known as the Warsaw Pact. And the Warsaw Pact was a direct answer to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. The Western European nations, United States, and Canada had created NATO to fight against the spread of communism. So the Soviet Union gets all the Eastern European Soviet-dominated nations and creates the Warsaw Pact. It's so named because it was signed in Warsaw, Poland. So those countries work together, and the Soviet Union also ruthlessly put down any kind of rebellions. There were some in Poland and Hungary, for instance. So Soviets were trying to make it clear that they were in charge of Eastern Europe. All right, so it starts off like maybe there's going to be some space to work together between the Soviets and the Americans, and they meet in Geneva, Switzerland, in 1955 for a summit or a meeting of leaders. And Eisenhower proposes an open skies treaty. And he said, look, what we'll do is we'll allow each other's airplanes, spy planes more or less, to fly over so we can keep eyes on each other and make sure that, see what the other guy's doing so we don't have to build up these massive military weapons. The Soviets said, no, we're not going to let you fly over. They understood that the United States had more air capability at the time, so they were able, that would have been beneficial for the U.S. Anyway, Eisenhower still wanted to gain information, so there were still spy planes from the U.S. flying over the Soviet Union. And in 1962, a U-2 spy plane was actually sent into the Soviet Union to inspect their military facilities, and the Soviets shot it down. This greatly damaged U.S.-Soviet relations. Soviets realized we continued spying on them. The U.S. got embarrassed by it. That whole thing with the pilot was taken. Finally, able to get him back. So it's not just a spy game. You have lots of actual battles and things of that going on. Not between the Soviet Union and the United States specifically, but you do have some hot spots that flare up besides Korea. Vietnam was beginning to ramp up at this time. And North Vietnam was under control of communists, under the control of Ho Chi Minh, who had fought for Vietnamese independence from the French. And South Vietnam was supported by the United States. And their president was really a pretty ruthless dictator. So this causes a civil war that's going to eventually bring the United States in. The Middle East is another place where the Cold War has a lot of impact. Arab-Israeli conflict was at a crisis point in 1948. The United States had just recognize Israel as a nation, and this created all kinds of outrage. And then, in Egypt, as Egypt is modernizing, they used the support of the Soviet Union to unify other Arab nations. This pan-Arab movement was often done with Soviet support. All right, so Vietnam was going to become probably the most important theater of war in the post-war period. You had these peace talks between the French and the Vietnamese, and they reflected the Cold War rivalries between communists and non-communists. So much like they did with Korea, they divide the country between North and South. The North will become communists, the South will become non-communists. And this was supposed to be a temporary division until elections happened to allow a government to be chosen. Now, Eisenhower wasn't crazy about the agreement, so what it did is it created the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, or SATO. And basically this is kind of like a NATO for Asia to prevent the spread of communism from China, North Korea, and North Vietnam. So they worked together to resist communist efforts. All right, so the United States supported South Vietnam. So we were putting money and weapons and all sorts of military and economic support into South Vietnam. And this is going to cause problems later on. In the Middle East, in 1948, Israel declared its independence. It had pushed the Jews in Israel had pushed the Palestinians out by and large by that time, and established an Israel, or a Jewish state named Israel. UN resolution divided Palestine into a Jewish and Arab state. So the United Nations had come up with the resolution that divided it and gave territory to both the Palestinians and the Jews. However, shortly after that, Arab nations attacked Israel, trying to basically force the Jewish government out. So Egypt, Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, Iraq all attacked Israel at the same time. Israel won, however, and the land of Palestine basically came under the control of Israel, and Jordan and Egypt got some of it in the treaty. But Israel basically gains more territory in the war, which is the exact opposite of what those guys wanted, the Arab nations wanted to happen. In Egypt, however, you have the growth of pan-Arabism, this idea that all Arab nations should be united as one. And Nasser was the president of Egypt, and he sought the support of the Soviet Union to aid him in this, because the United States obviously was a huge supporter of Israel. They weren't helpful in this, and the United States wasn't seeking to help this pan-Arabism. So they went to another place. The U.S. leaders didn't like it, took their support away from the Aswan High Dam, and this caused Nasser, when the U.S. no longer supported the building of that dam, he said, okay, well, I'm just going to take the Suez Canal back into, it was in British and French hands at the time. So Nasser said, that's in Egypt, it's ours now. And this almost causes a war. And basically, what happens is the British and French are sending troops, and the United States is trying to prevent a wide-scale war, and they say, no, no, don't. The British and French do it anyway, so basically the U.S. says, you know what? If you keep sending troops, we're gonna call in all the debts that you owe us right now. Of course, Britain's economy would have been wrecked by that, and they pulled back. So then you had the Eisenhower Doctrine, and this said basically that the U.S. would aid any nation in the Mideast trying to resist communism, and would commit military troops to ensure its interests in the Middle East. All right, so that ends us up with the Eisenhower. Some very important things. I mean, you have kind of the beginnings of the space race going on. You have the beginnings of brinkmanship and this idea of taking us to the brink of war with the Soviets, which is going to bring us close to World War III a couple of times. And also, you have this growth of pan-Arabism in the Middle East, this nationalism in Vietnam that's going to lead to civil war and bring the United States in. And then the Eisenhower Doctrine, which says the United States will respond militarily to protect its interests in the Middle East, oil and otherwise, and anti-communism. And this is going to set us up for our involvement in the Middle East for the next, till today. So we'll talk tomorrow about nuclear war, next time about nuclear war. Talk to you later.